She predicted her own death rite down to the hour. But who really held the pen? Welcome to Rust Evidence. I am your host, Silas Wren. I'd love to know where in the world are you watching from? Your comments always bring this community to life. Let's dive in. It had rained the day before, and the pavements of Boulevard Richard Lenoir still glistened as though reluctant to dry. Chief Inspector Maigret stood by the window of his apartment, the wide sash slightly open despite the season. From the street below came the muted rattle of a milk cart and the indistinct murmur of early voices, layered beneath the sound of water collecting in the gutters. The cold air that entered through the narrow gap raised gooseflesh on Maigret's forearm, but he made no move to close the window. Madame Maigret appeared in the doorway with a wool scarf draped over one arm, her usual gentle disapproval folded into the look she gave him. "You'll catch cold, Jules." "I might," he agreed quietly, and turned from the window. He didn't explain that he'd been standing there for nearly half an hour, waiting for nothing in particular. There had been no urgent call from the Quai des Orfèvres, no telegram, just an odd feeling since waking, the sort of unease that didn't come with a reason, only with a draft under the door or a shadow that lingered a little too long before. Moving on, Maigret took the scarf without protest and began knotting it, his fingers slow, almost distracted. His wife returned to the kitchen, where something warm and faintly sweet simmered on the stove. "Do you remember the name Madame Arnault?" he asked after a moment. From behind the partition, "the one who lived above the grocer's, in the 11th? She died last week. Pneumonia, they say." There was a pause, a ladle resting against a rim, perhaps, and then Madame Maigret's voice returned, more softly. She was always alone. She used to talk to herself in the stairwell. Maigret nodded, though she couldn't see him. He remembered the woman, a thin, angular silhouette with tightly pinned hair and a leather handbag that looked as if it had once been fashionable. She had once made a report about hearing voices through the walls. Not paranoia, Maigret had thought at the time, just the echo of loneliness. That had been over a year ago. No one had followed up. He lit his pipe and puffed once, then again, as though trying to dislodge something more than tobacco. Then the phone rang, not the one on the writing desk in the parlor, but the line reserved for official calls. Its sound was neither shrill nor urgent. A calm summons, indifferent but insistent. Maigret crossed the room and picked up the receiver. Maigret. A moment passed on the other end before a voice, nasal and dry, spoke. "It's Inspector Janvier, Chief. We've got something odd in Montmartre." "Odd?" "A woman, found in her flat." "Nothing violent, not really. But she left a letter." "Suicide?" "That's the odd part. She didn't take anything. No gas, no pills. Just a letter. Then she went to bed, like she meant to wake up." Maigret frowned, pipe cooling in his hand. "Who found her?" "Landlady. Thought the rent was late." "But the letter was dated 3 days ago." Maigret said nothing for a few seconds, then placed the pipe in the ashtray. "I'll come," he said as he shrugged on his coat. Madame Maigret appeared again. "Something?" "Possibly nothing," he said. "A woman wrote her own death. Note, but she didn't die." He kissed her cheek and stepped out into the corridor, where the scent of boiled milk still lingered faintly from someone else's breakfast. Outside, the streets had begun to dry, but the sky promised more rain. As he walked, Maigret felt the quiet thrum of the city around him. the stirrings behind shuttered windows, the twitch of curtains, the beginning of another day filled with people pretending to be certain of themselves. He lit another match and cupped the flame against the wind, then let it die. There was something in it. He didn't know what. Not yet. But he felt it, the subtle pull of something unfinished, something waiting in silence behind a door that hadn't been opened. In a long time, the taxi deposited Maigret at the bottom of Rue des Martyrs, where the incline began to rise sharply toward the butte. The morning was cool and clouded, the sidewalks damp underfoot. As he climbed, his breath came in short, visible puffs. A few shutters were still drawn, though the cafes were beginning to stir, a baker stepping out with a tray of croissants, a dog sniffing the base of a lamp-post. It was not yet 8. He paused under the awning of number 47, a building that once might have been handsome in its symmetry, but now bore the tired slump of long years and many tenants. The glass of the front door was etched with old scratches and fogged with grime, the kind that never quite went away, no matter how much it was cleaned. Janvier was waiting in the entrance, his coat unbuttoned and his hands deep in his pockets. "She's still upstairs," Janvier said. "We've kept it quiet. The landlady didn't tell the neighbors anything. She's the curious type, but cautious." Maigret nodded, brushing the damp from his hat brim. They climbed together, their steps echoing in the stairwell. The floorboards on the third landing creaked slightly underfoot. Janvier gestured to the door on the left, which stood ajar. She didn't answer the knock. The landlady opened with her own key yesterday evening, found the place empty, except for her, sitting in a chair fully dressed as if waiting. "Name?" Claire murmured. 37. "She's been here 6 years. No complaints, always paid the rent on time. Lived alone. Worked as a secretary at a small architecture firm down in Peguillet." Maigret stepped inside. The apartment was small, 2 rooms, kitchen, bath, and orderly. Nothing broken, nothing knocked over, nothing hurried. A faint, musty warmth clung to the space, the scent of closed curtains and old wool, the kind of room that seemed reluctant to change even when lived in. There was a half-finished crossword on the table, a clock that ticked with just enough irregularity to be noticed, and on the desk beneath the window a single envelope. Maigret moved toward it. The envelope was pale cream, unsealed, with a thin fold mark running horizontally across its middle. On the front, in slanted, unhurried script, to be read in silence. He opened it without gloves. Inside, a single sheet, neatly written in blue ink. No header, no date. It began without preamble. "To whom it may concern or not, by the time this is found, I will have already said goodbye. But please understand, this is not an act of despair. It is a withdrawal, nothing more. I have made peace with silence and with the knowledge that I have nothing more to say to the world, nor it to me. Do not search for causes. There is no villain, no melodrama, no scandal, only distance. That is a LLCM. Maigret read it twice. It didn't read like a suicide note. It read like a letter someone wrote to disappear. "Where is she now?" he asked Janvier, folding the paper again. "Still in the apartment. Bedroom." He followed Janvier into the adjoining room. The blinds were drawn, casting the space in. A gray half-light. A woman sat upright in the narrow bed, her hands resting neatly in her lap. Her eyes were closed. Maigret looked at her for a long moment. She was not dead. Her chest rose and fell slowly, peacefully, as if asleep. No signs of struggle, no discoloration. A faint trace of face powder lingered at the edge of her hairline. She didn't answer when the concierge knocked, Janvier said, voice low. She looked like this when we found her, still breathing. No alcohol, no pills in her system according to the doctor. It's like she just stopped reacting. Maigret leaned closer, observing her features. Claire Murden had the kind of face people often described as well-kept. Not beautiful, not plain, practiced, measured. There was a faint vertical line between her brows that suggested a habitual frown, but in sleep it was gone. He moved to the small table beside the bed, a glass of water untouched, a book with a train ticket tucked in as a bookmark. The date on the ticket, 2 weeks ago. She meant to leave, Maigret murmured, but she didn't. No. He looked again at the woman. She came back. Instead, there was a silence filled only by the sound of the clock in the other room. Maigret straightened. I want to speak to the landlady. And the people in the building, quietly. We won't wake her yet. You think she's faking? Janvier asked. No, Maigret said, taking his coat off. She's hiding, and she doesn't even need to leave the room to do it. He moved to the window, cracked it open an inch, and let the cold air in. The sound of footsteps echoed on the pavement below, rhythmic and ordinary. Maigret watched. For a moment before drawing up a chair and sitting down, he would wait. The stairs creaked again, this time under the measured weight of Madame Cazeneuve, the landlady, as she ascended to meet Maigret. Janvier had fetched her without much persuasion. She was a stout woman in her 60s, with her hair arranged in a kind of stiff gray helmet, and the shoulders of someone used to carrying many sacks of coal during the war. Her eyes narrowed at Maigret as she entered, not unfriendly, but accustomed to sizing people up before deciding what to say. She smelled faintly of bergamot and linoleum. "You're the inspector?" she asked, folding her hands before her with practiced formality. "Chief Inspector Maigret," he corrected gently. He rose, offered her a chair, and sat again. "She's not dead," Madame Cazeneuve said before he could speak. "No," he replied. "She's sleeping, or pretending to. Not pretending. I've seen enough of that to know. She's gone inside herself like a cat in winter." Maigret considered this without comment. From the bedroom came the soft tick of the clock. "You found her yesterday?" "Late afternoon, around 6. I don't usually interfere, but the rent envelope hadn't appeared in my box, and she's never late. I knocked once, twice. Then I used my spare key." She looked toward the adjoining room. There she was, as she is now. "Did you notice anything unusual in the past few days? Visitors? Quarrels?" "No visitors. Not that I saw. She wasn't the type. Quiet, always polite. Neat, though never fussy. Paid on time. Came and went like a ghost." Maigret nodded. "And before she came here?" "She mentioned once she'd lived in the 14th, near Elijah. She didn't talk much about her past. She worked down in Pigalle, in an architect's office. Took the bus in the mornings, walked back most nights. Wore the same coat all winter. Good wool. Not new." There was something in Madame Cazeneuve's tone, not gossipy, not resentful, but touched by an obscure sympathy. She had observed Claire Morand not as a landlady watches a tenant, but as one lonely woman recognizes the habits of another. Did she ever seem afraid? Not exactly. She was wary, like someone who's been left before and doesn't trust people to stay. Maigret paused. He reached into his coat pocket and produced the folded letter. Did she say anything that might explain this? He asked, laying the note on the table. Madame Cazeneuve didn't reach for it. She said less and less in the past few months. Came home earlier. Stopped reading in the cafe downstairs. I once asked if she was all right, and she said, "There's a limit to everything, even waiting." I didn't know what she meant. And her apartment, you never saw anything out of place? No, except, she hesitated. Yes? She changed the lock, quietly, about 2 months ago. Paid for it herself. Told me she'd lost the key, but I saw the old cylinder. In the trash. The key wasn't lost. She wanted someone kept out. Maigret gave a slow nod. Do you have any other tenants who knew her? Only Monsieur Mellard across the hall. He's retired. Used to be a notary's clerk. Watches everything. Remembers little. Still drinks coffee from a bowl. The others, a couple of students downstairs, a widow with a son who works nights. No one close. I'd like to speak with Mellard. Madame Cazeneuve stood slowly, brushing invisible dust from her skirt. He'll be in. Doesn't like to go out before noon. As she left, Maigret rose and moved again to the bedroom. Claire's face was unchanged, her stillness unnerving. He studied the bedside table again. The water remained untouched. Dottie picked up the train ticket, tucked in her book, 2nd class, to Lille. Open date. It had been purchased, but not used. He turned it over, then replaced it carefully. A knock at the door. Janvier returned with a tall, bent man in a threadbare cardigan and thick woolen socks inside his slippers. Monsieur Mellard, Janvier, said by way of introduction. Maigret offered his hand. The man took it loosely, as though the formality had lost all meaning through repetition. You live across the hall? Yes, since 1937. Do you know Madame Morand? Only in passing. We nodded. She rarely spoke. Did you notice anything strange recently? She cried one night, 3 weeks ago, through the wall. Not loudly. Just a little sound, like a kettle boiling. Then nothing. Maigret studied him. Did you hear anyone in her flat? Before or after? No, but I'm deaf in one ear. Since the war. He tapped the side of his head. I hear everything or nothing, depending on which side it's on. Did she ever have visitors? Once, a man. Back in January. Midday, stayed about half an hour. They didn't argue. I listened. You listened? Mallard tilted his head, unashamed. Old walls. I didn't try to, but you hear what you hear. What did you hear? Quiet voices, then footsteps, then the door. She locked it behind him. Maigret paused. Could you describe him? Tall, thin, hat and coat. That's all I saw. Didn't look back. When she cried, was it the same night? No, much later. Maigret stood and gestured toward the door. Thank you. That's all. Mellard looked toward the bedroom, something close to sadness in his face. She never spoke above a whisper, even when she laughed. When the door closed behind him, Maigret turned back to Janvier. She changed her lock after that visit. Stopped going out, bought a train ticket, never used it. Wrote a note that sounds like she's saying goodbye to being looked at, spoken to, touched. Janvier nodded slowly. She's escaping someone? Maigret shook his head. Escaping. Something, maybe someone too. But mostly, I think she didn't want to be seen anymore. He walked once more through the small rooms. No photographs, no letters, no keepsakes. A calendar with no markings. A coat hanging neatly on the rack, worn at the elbows. A small bottle of perfume, untouched. This is a woman who erased herself by degrees, Maigret said. Janvier frowned. So what do? We wait, Maigret said simply. And we find out who came here in January. He stepped to the window and watched the street below. Paris moved as it always did, indifferent, wet, and murmuring with a slow life, as strangers brushing past one another. Somewhere down there, he thought, someone knows why Claire Morand stopped answering the world, and why she wrote her death note, as though it were an invitation to disappear. It was nearly 11 when Maigret arrived at the modest architecture firm tucked behind the corner of Rue Blanche. The building was unremarkable, a gray stone facade with peeling paint around the windows and a dented brass plaque near the door. Lenoir et Fils Architecture, Urbanism, Dépôt de Plans. Inside, the air smelled of ink and tracing paper, and the tick of a wall clock was loud enough to be noticed. A young man with ink-stained fingers looked up from a drafting table as Maigret entered, his sleeves rolled to the elbows and a pencil behind his ear. He blinked, uncertain whether to be helpful or defensive. "I'm looking for someone who worked here," Maigret said, removing his hat and folding it under one arm. "Claire Morand." The young man stood a little straighter. "Yes, of course. Mademoiselle Morand. She hasn't been in for several days. Did something happen?" "She's ill," Maigret said simply. "Nothing serious. I'd just like to ask a few questions. Is your employer in?" "Mr. Lenoir's away until tomorrow. But his son is here, Henry." The young man disappeared down a hallway, and within a minute a thin man in his 40s emerged, buttoning the cuffs of a navy blue suit that looked slightly too new for its wearer. Henry Lenoir had thinning hair, a long nose, and a mouth that seemed always to be on the verge of a polite smile. "I'm Henry Lenoir," he said, offering a quick handshake. "You said you're—" "Maigret, police." Henry's expression didn't change, but his posture stiffened slightly. He gestured toward a cramped office with a desk and 2 leather chairs, one cracked at the seams. "Please." They sat. Lenoir took out a cigarette and lit it with a silver lighter that clicked twice before catching. Maigret declined when offered one of his own. "You said Mademoiselle Morand is ill?" "She hasn't spoken in several days. She's conscious but unresponsive. We're trying to understand why." Lenoir blew out a slow stream of smoke. "That's strange. She was perfectly fine the last time she was here." "When was that?" "Tuesday of last week, 8 days ago. She left around 5 as usual. Quiet as always." "What was her role here?" "Administrative, filing, scheduling, answering the telephone. She was precise, discreet. Never caused any fuss." Maigret nodded slowly, glancing around the small office. A line of books on structural design, a photograph of a villa, 2 framed awards dated over a decade ago. "Do you know if she had friends here?" "Not really. She was cordial, but distant, ate alone, took her breaks walking. I sometimes wondered if she was lonely. but she didn't encourage familiarity. Did she ever speak of anyone, a relative, a man, someone she might have been involved with? Lenoir shook his head. She was private. We respected that. Maigret studied him quietly. The man's collar was starched a little too sharply, and the way he tapped his cigarette against the ashtray had a certain nervous rhythm to it. Not guilt, not necessarily, but discomfort. Something unspoken hovered between his words. Has she ever had a visitor at the office? Maigret asked. Lenoir paused. Once or twice, I believe, a man came by. January or February, I think. I didn't see him personally, but Renier, our junior, mentioned it. Can I speak with him? Lenoir gestured toward the outer room. He was the young man who greeted you. They stepped out, and René, the ink-fingered draftsman, stood awkwardly as Maigret approached. You said you saw someone visit Mademoiselle Morand? Yes. Sir, just once, a few months ago. Tall man, older. Wore a coat with a velvet collar. Spoke quietly. She didn't look happy to see him. What makes you say that? She didn't get up. Just looked at him like she hadn't expected him. They spoke for 5 minutes tops. Then he left. She sat there for a long time after, not working. Did you hear anything they said? No, sir. I only noticed the way she looked at him, like he reminded her of something she wanted to forget. Maigret nodded. Thank you. As he left the office, René called softly after him, almost apologetically. I think he came back once, he said. But she wasn't in. He stood outside for a while, then left. Maigret didn't ask how René had seen this. It was clear the young man paid attention to things most people missed. Back out on the street, the clouds had begun to break into lighter shades, and a watery sun glanced off the rooftops. Maigret stood still for a moment, lighting his pipe. He could feel it now. Not the shape of the thing, not yet, but the weight of it. Claire Morin's fear wasn't sudden. It had built slowly, visit by visit, silence by silence. He walked, without haste, to the café across from the office and took a small table outside, ordering a beer and sipping it slowly while watching the building opposite. A man might return again, unaware she wasn't there, or he might not. But Maigret had long ago learned that answers often sat just beneath the surface, if one was patient enough to let them rise. When the glass was half empty, he reached into his coat and unfolded Claire's note again. The words read differently now, not abstract, but lived in. There is no villain, she had written, only distance. A peculiar line. Most people fled something. She had fled the absence of something. A past, perhaps. A man who looked. Like memory, finishing his drink, Maigret returned to the police station. A quiet corner of the file room held what he needed. Old records, ID cards, address changes, archived witness reports. Claire Morin's employment history matched what he knew. Clerical jobs, short spells in various firms, no criminal record, no complaints. But then, a note in the margin of an older file from 5 years ago. A formal deposition filed in Levallois. A complaint made by a Claire Morin against a man named Gerard Fleury. The charges: persistent unwanted contact, public disturbance, attempted intimidation. No conviction. The case had been dismissed for lack of evidence. But it had left a paper trail, and Maigret followed it. Gerard Fleury, age 49, former insurance agent, No fixed employer now. Last known address, Rue Costine. Maigret copied the address and slipped the note into his coat pocket. He didn't go there yet. Instead, he returned to Rue des Martyrs. Claire was still sleeping. The blinds had been drawn more fully now, and a nurse had been brought in on Madame Cazeneuve's suggestion. The flat was dark and close, as though absorbing her silence into its walls. He sat beside her again, quietly. Her breathing remained soft and shallow, her hands folded precisely as before, as if she had measured her own withdrawal to the inch. "Claire," he said gently, "I think I know who came to see you. I think you knew he would return." She did not stir, but Maigret thought, perhaps. The line between her brows deepened for just a second, a faint crease, like a thought struggling to reach the surface dot. It was not evidence, but it was enough. He would go to Rue Costine tomorrow. It was a gray morning. Again, with mist clinging low over Montmartre, like a shawl forgotten on the shoulders of the hill, Maigret stood in front of number 88, Rue Costine, a nondescript building, with a slight lean to the left, as if the whole facade were hesitating. A sign on the door read "Concierge absent," and the bell beside it gave only a dull click when pressed. He stepped back and looked up. On the second floor, the curtain twitched. A moment later, a figure appeared at the window, not hiding, not waving, simply standing, watching. Ge acute rard fleury .maigr. E.T. knew it, instinctively, not from the man's face, which he had never seen before, but from the stillness. It was the posture of a man who expected nothing good from visitors. The door opened before he could ring again. A girl of perhaps 10 stood there barefoot, clutching a crust of bread. She looked at him with mild suspicion and held the door without speaking. Maigret tipped his hat. "Merci." The stairs smelled faintly of cabbage and old pipe smoke. He climbed without hurry. The second-floor landing was dim, the wallpaper damp from years of forgotten leaks. The door was ajar. Fleury stood just behind it, not quite blocking the entrance, not quite welcoming it either. He was tall, as described, with thinning black hair, combed straight back, and a narrow face marked by long vertical lines at the mouth, a kind of lines formed not by age but by a habit of grimacing when no one was looking. He wore a sweater over a shirt with no collar and slacks that had seen better days. "You're the police," he said. It wasn't a question. Maigret. The inspector extended his hand slowly, not insistently. Fleury hesitated, then shook it with a dry, indifferent grip. "I've done nothing wrong," he said, stepping back to let him in. "I didn't say you had." The apartment was small and impersonal, as if the man occupying it had settled only temporarily. A table with 2 chairs, a bed with a gray blanket folded precisely at the foot. No photographs, no books. A clean ashtray beside the window, and a kettle just beginning to hiss on the stove. "You knew Claire Morand," Maigret said, not sitting, just standing near the wall. "I did. Years ago. You visited her in January." "Yes." "She didn't seem pleased to see you." Fleury turned to the kettle, took it off the heat, and poured water into a chipped enamel cup, though he didn't offer any to Maigret. "She wasn't expecting me. You wanted something from her." "No." "Then why visit?" Fleury sipped the tea. "I wanted to apologize." "For what?" "For things I said. For how I behaved. She deserved better than the man I was then." Margaret watched him for a long moment. There was a complaint against you, filed in Levallois. You followed her, waited outside her job. She asked for police protection. I never hurt her. That's not what I said. Fleury exhaled. It was years ago. I'd just lost my job. My marriage had collapsed. She was kind to me, then stopped returning my letters. I thought if I could explain. He shook his head. It doesn't matter now. She changed the locks after you came. She said I shouldn't come again. So I didn't. Except that you did. Fleury looked up sharply. I walked past once. I didn't knock. Why not? Because I saw her face when she looked at me the first time. It was like she'd never been safe. And I realized I had put that there. It wasn't the speech Margaret expected. He said nothing for a while, studying the man. You frightened her, Margaret said finally. I know. She's not well. Now, Fleury's eyes narrowed. She's not? She hasn't spoken in 4 days. She lies in bed as if she's withdrawn from the world. Not asleep, not awake, just absent. Something moved across Fleury's face then. Not guilt, not panic. Something more evasive. A tight-lipped recognition, like someone watching a building collapse they had once helped design. I didn't. Mean for that, he said. Margaret stepped closer, not threateningly, just enough to let his presence settle in the room. Tell me what happened when you saw her. All of it. Fleury didn't move. The kettle hissed again, faintly behind him. She opened the door. She looked older than I remembered, but tired, too. She didn't invite me in. I told her I was sorry. She didn't answer, just looked at me. So I said it again. She asked why I'd come. I said I'd been thinking about her, that I'd changed. Had you? I thought so. And now? Fleury looked down. Now I don't know. What else did she say? She asked me what I wanted from her. I told her nothing, just to see her once more and leave her in peace. Then she said, you don't understand. Peace is not something you give back once you've taken it. And she closed the door. Margaret nodded slowly. And after that, I walked away. You were seen waiting outside. Fleury's mouth twitched. I hoped she'd come. Out, not to talk, just to see her walk past me, alive. And did she? No. They stood in silence for a long moment. Margaret looked again around the room. The precise folding of the blanket, the neatly washed plate in the sink, the absence of clutter or chaos. It was a room kept by a man trying to exert control over something, even if only his furniture. She bought a train ticket to Lille, Margaret said at last. Fleury looked up, startled. She never used it, Margaret continued. She meant to leave Paris, maybe to get away from you. Maybe from herself, but something stopped her. She wrote a note. It reads like a goodbye. Not to life, but to being known. Fleury sank slowly into the one chair at the table, his shoulders sagging. I didn't know she was planning to leave. She was planning to vanish. And then something, or someone made her stay. Margaret let the quiet grow between them. Fleury's hands were now folded in his lap, fingers twisting slowly. I didn't follow her again, he said. I swear to you. I thought she'd left the city. I would have been glad if she had. I believe you. Margaret stepped to the door, then paused. Sometimes, he said, people disappear not out of fear, but because they think the world no longer hears them. You don't need to strike someone to make them mute. Fleury looked up. His eyes were red around the edges, but dry. "If I had known," he said quietly, "I wouldn't have knocked. I wouldn't have come near." Maigret left without replying. The girl downstairs was now playing with chalk on the pavement. She glanced up at him with curiosity, then bent again to draw a crooked sun beside a house with too many windows. The mist had lifted slightly. The sky was still pale, but the rain had paused. Maigret turned up the collar of his coat and made his way slowly back toward the station. He had what he needed, but not what he understood. The next morning was crisp and oddly bright, the kind of morning that seemed to deny the heaviness of the case pressing in on Maigret's thoughts. He rose earlier than usual, not out of urgency but restlessness, the kind that tugged at the edges of his thoughts and made coffee taste faintly metallic dot at the breakfast table. Madame Maigret had already set out a dish of warm brioche and a small pot of apricot jam. The kitchen was quiet except for the low hum of the radio, which she turned down with a twist of her fingers when he sat. "You didn't sleep," she said, without looking at him. "I slept," Maigret answered, not very convincingly. She buttered a piece of bread and passed it to him. "I can always tell when you're working through something. You press your lips together in your sleep, like you're about to speak but decide not to." He gave a tired smile and reached for the coffee. Outside the window, a street cleaner passed with rhythmic sweeps, the bristles of the broom sounding like rain on tile. "Do you remember that story about the woman who used to live above the pastry shop?" Madame Maigret asked suddenly. "The one who wore gloves even in July?" "Yes, she came to the market every Thursday. Everyone knew she lived alone, but she always walked like someone was waiting for her at home. I remember. One morning, she just stopped coming. For weeks no one noticed. Then the baker mentioned it, and people realized she'd been gone. They said she had family elsewhere, but the concierge told me she used to get letters with no return address. Every Monday. Always in blue envelopes." Maigret looked at her, waiting. Madame Maigret shrugged. "I suppose what I'm saying is, sometimes people don't disappear all at once. They go in steps." He set his cup down gently. "Like Claire, she didn't leave because she was afraid. She stayed because she had already gone piece by piece." There was a long silence between them, filled only by the rattle of the spoon in the sugar bowl. Then Maigret stood and kissed her cheek. "Thank you," he said. He left for Rue des Martyrs again, walking instead of taking a taxi. He wanted the rhythm of his steps, the cold air in his lungs. He passed shopkeepers raising metal shutters, a woman feeding pigeons near a fountain, a boy running to school with a scarf trailing behind him like a flag. When he reached the building, Madame Cazeneuve was outside sweeping the front step, bundled in a thick shawl and rubber boots. She looked up with a nod and moved aside to let him in. "She's the same," she said softly, eyes open but looking inward. He climbed to the flat and let himself in. The nurse was seated in the parlor with a knitting bag on her lap, her needles still. "She doesn't respond," the nurse whispered. "But her pulse is steady. It's like she's waiting." Maigret nodded and moved to the bedroom. The curtains had been pulled back slightly, letting in a pale slice of light. Claire Murrin lay just as before, her hands folded, her eyes half-lidded. He took the chair beside her bed and sat down. For a long time he said nothing, just breathed in the scent of lavender water and old wallpaper. Then, very quietly, I spoke to Gerard Fleury. He says he came to apologize. I believe he meant it, but it wasn't enough, was it? No reaction, only the slow, deliberate movement of breath. You didn't vanish to avoid him. You vanished, because no one came when it mattered. You wrote your own ending, but you weren't sure how to close the book. Still nothing. But Maigret wasn't watching her face now. He was watching her hands. A small change. They had unclasped slightly. One thumb twitched. The movement was so slight it might have meant nothing. But Maigret had built his life on such nothings. He leaned forward. You didn't go to Lyle because you didn't want to run anymore. You were tired of being a shadow. You thought, if I disappear without leaving, someone will notice. Someone will look at me and say, she's still here. A single tear ran from the corner of her left eye. Maigret stood, walked to the window, and lit his pipe. He didn't speak again. He simply stood there, filling the room with quiet presence. The kind of presence that made people speak even when they hadn't meant to. He stayed until noon dot when he left. Claire's hands were no longer folded. Downstairs, in the hallway, Madame Cazeneuve had left a pot of tea and 2 biscuits on the small table by the stairwell. The kind of quiet gesture Maigret valued more than signatures or declarations. He paused on the step and turned to Janvier, who had arrived just minutes earlier. "We won't push her," Maigret said. "We'll wait." "For what?" "For her to return in her own time." Janvier looked skeptical, but said nothing. On the street, the sun had broken through for the first time in days. Maigret turned up his collar out of habit, though the chill had softened. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret stopped by the file's desk and requested everything they had on Claire. Muren's old residence in the 14th arrondissement. A police report had been filed years before, an incident involving noise complaints. A missing tenant, a neighbor who claimed Claire, had argued with a man in the hallway late at night, that it was nothing conclusive. But it confirmed a pattern. Every time Claire Morin had tried to settle, a man, always unnamed, had appeared. A shadow, a knock, a silence afterward. She hadn't been running from one person. She had been running from the memory of being, silenced again and again. Maigret leaned back in his chair and looked out at the Seine, which flowed gray and cold beneath the Pont Saint-Michel. A man could watch that river every day for years and never notice its changes, but it was always moving, always reshaping its edges, quietly just like Claire. He didn't need a confession. He didn't need a crime. What he needed and what she needed was space, and time. The nurse had stepped out to buy bread and broth when Maigret returned that afternoon. A soft rain was falling, not enough to soak through, but enough to make the air heavy with the scent of wet stone. Maigret's coat was speckled with it. He left his hat on the hall table and stepped into the bedroom with the same quiet reverence. One might show when entering a chapel that Claire Morin was no longer lying flat. Someone, perhaps the nurse, had propped her up with 2 pillows, and though her hands were still folded, her eyes were open and focused, not staring, seeing Maigret moved slowly, pulling the same chair beside the bed, but this time he did not sit. He remained standing, his hands in his coat pockets, pipe unlit in his mouth. She blinked. "Once dot, then?" In a voice dry with disuse, she said, "You came back." Margaret didn't smile. He removed the pipe, nodded once, and said simply, "Yes." She turned her face slightly toward the window. The rain made a soft tapping against the glass. "I thought I would stay silent forever," she said. "You nearly managed it." There was the ghost of a smile then, thin and fleeting. "You're not going to ask me why," she said. "I think you'll tell me if it matters." "I don't know if it does. What's the difference between a vanishing and a forgetting?" Margaret moved slowly, finally sitting. He placed the pipe on the table and leaned forward, elbows on knees. "You wrote a letter," he said. "You wrote it as if you were disappearing. But then you stayed. Why?" "I couldn't decide whether I wanted to die or be left alone." Her voice was stronger now, gaining weight word by word. She looked at him fully, and he saw a new sharpness in her gaze, not youthful, not vibrant, but resolved. "I didn't want anyone to stop me," she continued. "But I wanted someone to notice." Margaret nodded. Fleury noticed. She gave a soft, bitter laugh. "Fleury, he notices what he wants to notice. He thinks regret is the same thing as change. Do you think he meant to hurt you?" "No," she said immediately. "Not in the way most people mean that word. He meant to possess me. He thought I was a chapter that hadn't finished. He didn't want me back. He wanted to believe I hadn't moved on." "You never answered his letters?" "No, not one. And when he stopped writing, I thought it was over. Then he found me again." Her voice faltered, but she didn't look away. Margaret waited. "I changed apartments. I changed jobs. I kept everything small, controlled, a new place, a quiet routine. I stopped making plans more than a day in advance, and still, he found me." She exhaled, not dramatically, but like someone setting down a weight they had carried too long. "It wasn't just him," she said. "It was the silence I'd learned to live in. After a while, you stopped speaking even in your own head. The idea of explaining yourself becomes exhausting." "You bought a train ticket," Margaret said, "to Lyle." "Yes, I thought I might go north. There's a boarding house my mother once stayed in. They wouldn't know me. I could be known. I thought that might be a kind of peace. But you didn't leave. I packed, I set my alarm. Then I sat at the table and stared at my suitcase for hours. I realized I wasn't afraid of starting over. I was afraid of never being found again." Margaret watched her in silence. Outside, the sound of rain softened, replaced by the scrape of a neighbor's window being pushed open. "I wrote the letter," she said. "I thought if someone really read it, they'd understand that it wasn't about death. It was about erasure, self-erasure, a kind of slow suicide without the violence." "Someone did read it," Margaret said, "and understood." Claire looked at him, and her eyes moistened, though no tears fell. "I never wanted it to be dramatic," she whispered. "I just didn't want to be someone people forgot to ask about." They sat for a long time, the clock ticking on the wall. Behind them, the steady rhythm of it folding around the silence like a blanket. Eventually, Margaret stood. "Do you want him to be charged?" he asked. "Fleury?" She shook her head. "No. What he didn't know what it meant to me. But I know. Will you leave Paris?" "I don't know yet. But I won't do it quietly this time. I think I might tell people." Let them say goodbye if they want. He picked up his coat. If you'd rather not be alone, I'd rather not, she said quickly. How? Send the nurse back in. Claire hesitated. Would you come again tomorrow? Maigret smiled, the first true smile since he'd entered the room. Yes, he said. I will. As he descended the stairs, Madame Cazeneuve was waiting on the landing, pretending to sweep a corner already spotless. She spoke? She asked, barely containing the question. She did? And? She's coming back. Madame Cazeneuve nodded, visibly relieved, but she didn't smile. She looked at him with something closer to gratitude, or maybe awe, as though surprised that presence, just being there, could unravel silence more than any question could. Maigret stepped out into the street. The rain had stopped. A smell of wet stone lingered, and in the distance a flower seller was arranging tulips in bunches on the corner by the metro. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, Lagnan was sulking over a stack of paperwork. He grunted when Maigret entered, then gestured vaguely to a form he was failing to complete. Maigret didn't bother with small talk. He walked past him, into his office, and shut the door gently. He didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel satisfied. He felt human. Grounded Dot, he lit his pipe and sat at the desk, but not to write a report. There would be no arrest, no headlines, only the memory of a woman slowly returning to herself, and the quiet truth that not all investigations end with justice. Some end with understanding. The office at the Quai des Orfèvres was quiet the next morning. Rain hadn't returned, but the sky hung low and heavy, with a pale pewter sheen. Maigret arrived earlier than usual, coat still damp from walking, a faint chill clinging to his shoulders. He didn't head directly to his desk. Instead, he made his way to the archives, the one beneath the rear staircase, where old personnel files and minor civilian records collected dust in a slow and indifferent decay. He carried a single note in his breast pocket. Folded in half, Claire Morin, 14th Arrondissement, Rue du Loir, 1949 to 1951. There had been something unfinished in her story, a shape beneath the surface that still tugged at him, not because it was essential to the law, but because it mattered to her, and perhaps in his own quiet way to him. The files in the cabinet were brittle and yellowed at the edges. Paris had long ago stopped caring about these papers, but Maigret hadn't. He read slowly, methodically, pulling thin dossiers from between thicker bundles, names smudged in ink, addresses long since demolished or repurposed, and then, finally, one that matched Claire Morin, tenant, Rue du Loir. Report filed June 3rd, 1950. He sat at the small iron desk and opened the file. It was thinner than he expected. A single-page incident report, no follow-up, no interview subject. Disturbance, complaint filed by neighbor, Madame Dupré. Details. Repeated raised voices, male visitor reported entering apartment multiple evenings. Description of male, age 40 to 50, dark overcoat, unpleasant tone. Police response. No physical altercation observed. Woman claimed nothing unusual. Case closed. Maigret exhaled softly and leaned back. There it was again, the shape of a story that had gone unsaid, a habit of disappearing behind polite denials. The pattern had begun long before Fleury, long before her job at the architecture firm. Perhaps long before Paris, he made a note of Madame Dupre's full name and address, now long outdated, then turned to the final section of the folder. A list of personal items catalogued by the building's concierge when Claire left. Clothes, kitchenware, books. One item caught his attention. Photograph in silver frame, glass cracked, not recovered. Maigret folded, the file closed. The empty frame. He thought by late morning he was walking again, not to Claire's current flat, but to the place she had loved 15 years before. Rue du Loiret was narrow and crooked, lined with apartments that had seen generations of tenants pass through them. Some buildings had been repainted in soft pastels. Others remained gray, like chipped stones. The concierge at number 12 was a small man with heavy spectacles and a pale blue sweater. He squinted at Maigret's identification for longer than necessary, then waved him in with an expression of cautious hospitality. "Looking for Madame Dupre," Maigret said. "She lived here around 1950. She was my aunt," the man said. "Died in 63. Fell asleep during the midday news and never woke up. Did she ever talk about a tenant named Claire Morand?" The man tilted his head. "Morand? Yes, she was the young woman on the 3rd floor, lived alone. Quiet, too quiet, my aunt always said." She filed a report. "She did that often, always listening through doors. Said she was protecting the building's reputation." "Did she mention anything about a man?" Now the man hesitated. "A few times. Said he came at odd hours. Looked respectable, but had wrong energy, whatever that means. My aunt liked neatness in people, not just their clothes." Maigret nodded, his eyes drifting to the mailboxes along the inner corridor. "Do you mind if I go up?" "Not at. All apartments empty again. Always seems to be. 3rd floor, front left." Maigret climbed the stairs slowly. At the landing he paused. The hallway was silent, filled with the quiet density that old buildings held in their walls, the memories of sounds no longer made. He pushed the door open. It hadn't been locked. The room was bare now. Floorboards dusty, windows streaked, with years of missed cleanings. But the bones of the place were the same. The curve of the wall near the radiator, the faint discoloration where a frame might once have hung. The light filtering in through the tall windows was soft and filtered. By lace curtains yellowed with time, he stood for a while without moving. He could imagine her here, 22, perhaps 23, making tea, with careful hands, the radio playing low, the quiet dread of footsteps in the stairwell. She had been afraid here, he thought. Not of violence, perhaps, but of being known too well by the wrong person. On the way down, the concierge stopped him with a small envelope in hand. "Found this in an old drawer," he said. "It has her name on it. Don't know why it was kept." Maigret accepted it without a word. The envelope was unsealed, aged but intact. Inside was a torn photograph, just the edge of a face, a man's chin and hand resting on someone's shoulder. The glass must have shattered. Only part of the photo remained. There was a smudge on the paper, where a thumb had once pressed too hard. He slipped it into his coat and left. Back at Rue des Martyrs, Claire was sitting up in bed when he arrived. The nurse was in the other room. The window was open a few inches, letting in the early afternoon breeze. Claire had her hands in her lap, turning them slowly, as if reacquainting herself with movement. "You walked here?" she asked. "I wanted to see something on the way." He sat beside her, not pulling out his notebook, not asking a question, just sitting. "You found the old place?" she asked before he could speak. "Yes," she nodded slowly. "I left too quietly. I left so little behind that I started to. Wonder if I had ever been there." "There was a photo," Margaret said, "or part of one. I broke it myself. The glass cracked. I didn't want to see his face any more." "Was it Fleury?" "No, another before him. The first one who taught me to stop asking to be understood." There was no bitterness in her voice, only an exhausted honesty. "I was very young," she continued, "and very careful. But you can't be careful enough when someone decides they know who you are better than you do." Margaret nodded. "Every time I tried to disappear," she said, "I took one more part of myself away. The girl who painted, the one who loved jazz, the woman who used to read poetry before bed. I stopped trusting those parts to be safe." "And now?" he asked. She looked out the window. "Now I think I might read again. Maybe even paint. Jazz?" she smiled faintly. "One thing at a time." Margaret stood to leave, pausing with his hand on the back of the chair. "You don't need to answer this," he said, "but I've wondered. Why the letter? Why leave it where someone would find it?" She didn't answer for a long time. Then, "Because if no one ever asked why, I would know I'd truly disappeared." He nodded, then stepped into the hallway. Madame Cazeneuve passed him carrying a folded tablecloth, and for a moment they exchanged a glance that needed no words. On the walk back to the office, Margaret didn't take the quickest route. He walked slowly, cutting across narrow side streets, past bakeries, bookstores, and apartment windows where radios hummed faintly and curtains moved in the breeze. Paris was a city full of lives, quietly unraveling and reassembling, unseen. But for now, one woman, just one, had started to return. The corridor outside Margaret's office at the Quai des Orfèvres echoed with the scuffed steps of clerks, the rustle of carbon copies, and the occasional squeak of a wooden chair reluctantly shifting under a junior inspector. It was the usual late afternoon atmosphere, not rushed, not lethargic, but humming with the kind of quiet tension that came when most of the day's work was done, yet none of it quite finished. Margaret sat at his desk, the heavy green blotter before him unusually bare. The brass lamp cast a narrow cone of light across the blank report form he'd pulled from the file cabinet an hour earlier. It was standard, black lettering, official margins, empty boxes to be filled in by hand. Boxes for date of offense, nature of crime, suspects, outcome, and recommendation for prosecution. He stared at the line labeled victim, then let his eyes wander to the one marked charge. There was no charge. No crime had been committed, and yet he could not, in good conscience, mark the file, no further action, and pass it along. He picked up his pen, turned it between his fingers, then laid it down again. There was a knock. Lagnon entered without waiting for a reply, clutching a folder thick with forms. He looked perpetually damp even on dry days, like a man who had been caught in the rain years ago and never quite dried out. "You haven't filed anything on the Montmartre woman," he said, dropping the file onto Margaret's desk. "Aware. Wasn't it a suicide attempt?" "No." "Then what was it?" Margaret considered the question. "A disappearance that failed?" Lagnon raised a skeptical eyebrow. And what's the official code for that? There isn't one. He could feel Lagnon's impatience, sharp and distinct, like a creak in a wooden beam. We can't just leave it open, Chief. Headquarters will want to know why a nurse was assigned, why Janvier filed a scene report, why a psychological evaluation was suggested. If there's no threat, no suspect, no motive. There was a motive, Maigret interrupted. It just wasn't criminal. He watched as Lagnon opened his mouth, then closed it again. There were times Maigret's tone didn't invite further argument, and this was one of them. With a small grunt, Lagnon lifted the folder and turned to go, but before he reached the door, he stopped. She's talking again, isn't she? The woman, Maigret nodded. Then it was worth something. And with that, Lagnon left. Later, alone, Maigret lit his pipe and opened a new sheet of paper. Unlined, not official. He wrote slowly in his own hand, the way he did when a case didn't belong in the archives but needed to be remembered. Claire Morand, age 37, resident of Rue des Martyrs. Not a case, a condition. An erosion of the self by degrees. Visited by Gerard Fleury, former acquaintance. No violence. No threats, only memory. The kind that bruises slowly. Subject did not flee. She retreated, inward. Evidence of pattern. Consistent across previous residences. A life managed in smaller and smaller circles. A private geography of survival. There was no crime. There was no culprit. But the weight of silence was enough to make her vanish from within. She has begun to return. Her speech is slow but steady. Her hands unfold. The light stays on at night. Recommendation. None. Observation. Human sorrow is not always prosecutable. Sometimes it must only be witnessed. He signed the page with a slow curl of his pen and slipped it into a folder marked personal, one of 3 such folders in the bottom drawer of his desk. Not evidence. Not for the records, just memory. The next day the superintendent called. I see no report on that Montmartre case. Maigret held the receiver between shoulder and ear as he lit his pipe. There was no case, sir. I don't care if there was no theft or assault. There was a public disturbance. A nurse assigned. A witness interview. I'm aware. So what am I to tell the prefecture when they ask why we assigned resources to a woman who did nothing more than fall asleep in her own bed? Maigret let the question sit in silence for several seconds. Then he answered, Tell them it's not always about what was done, but what might have been. There was an exasperated exhale from the other end. You know, Maigret, if you were a younger man, I'd have had you reassigned to traffic duty years ago. I know. He replaced the receiver gently. That afternoon, Maigret returned once more to Claire Morand's apartment. She was sitting at the small dining table, a cardigan pulled loosely over her shoulders. The window was open wider than before. On the table lay a small notebook and a pen. A faint line of music drifted in from somewhere outside, a clarinet, perhaps, or an old phonograph playing in another apartment. I went for a walk this morning, Claire said, without prompting, only to the end of the street. But it felt like enough. Maigret nodded. He didn't ask how it felt. The act spoke for itself. There's a bench near the florist, she continued. I sat there and watched a dog try to untangle its leash from a lamp-post. She smiled a little. Maigret poured them both a cup of tea from the pot Madame Cazeneuve had left. It was strong and dark and still faintly steaming. "There was a time," Claire said, after a few sips, "when I thought it would be easier to vanish entirely than to explain myself to even one more person." "It's not an uncommon thought," Maigret replied. "But it's a lie," she said. "You don't disappear cleanly. You disappear in fragments, and people only notice when the last piece goes missing." He nodded, "And sometimes not even." Then she looked out the window. "I think I'd like to go back to work." "Same place?" "No, somewhere quieter. I may take the train to Lille just for a few days. See if it feels different now. Don't forget to return." "I won't." She looked at him. "You came back when you didn't have to." "I usually do," he said. That evening at home, Maigret sat by the fire with a glass of beer in hand and his pipe lit but idle. Madame Maigret knitted quietly beside him, the soft clack of needles underscoring the gentle tick of the clock on the mantel. He didn't speak of Claire Morand. He didn't need to. But as the fire settled into glowing embers, he turned to his wife and said, "Do you remember that Sunday in Dieppe, years ago, when we sat under that awning during the storm?" She looked up. "You said nothing for an hour." "I was thinking," he said, "how hard it is to really know when someone's drowning, even if they're right beside you." Madame Maigret set her knitting down gently. "And what made you think of that now?" "No reason," he said. "Just the weather, I suppose." Outside it had begun to rain again, softly, steadily, without urgency. Maigret listened, and let the silence grow. The first true spring day arrived without announcement. The rain, which had dominated the city for nearly a week, had receded into the gutters, leaving the sidewalks dry and warm underfoot. On Boulevard Voltaire, cafe chairs appeared on terraces like birds testing the air after a storm. Paris, Maigret thought, was always waiting for its next season of self-renewal. He sat alone at a corner table of the Brasserie Dauphine, a modest beer before him, and the warm light of the afternoon making his pipe smoke seem less like habit, and more like punctuation between thoughts. Claire Morand had taken the train to Lille 2 days ago. She had written a short note, not a farewell, not a declaration, just a line or two in a careful, even hand. "I am going, but I will return. I think I want to be known again." She had signed only her initials, no address, no details, and Maigret had read it twice before tucking it into his breast pocket. He hadn't filed it. He hadn't told anyone it existed. There were cases that never made it into the books, and not because they were failures. Some were too human, too quiet, too inward to survive the machinery of bureaucracy. What would he have written? That a woman disappeared into herself for years, until someone asked if she still wanted to be seen. He sipped the beer, now slightly flat, and watched the light shift across the pavement as waiters passed with clinking trays. 2 men in suits were discussing politics without conviction. A woman in a yellow coat fed crumbs to sparrows, 1 piece at a time, as if measuring their hunger. Across the street, Janvier emerged from a tatin, lighting a cigarette with his usual one-handed precision. He spotted Maigret and crossed over. "You've been sitting here long?" "Not long enough," Maigret said. Janvier took the chair opposite, waved for a coffee, and leaned forward on his elbows. I've gone over the reports, the ones that never quite closed. Your drawer's full of them. They're not meant to be solved, Janvier smirked. You always say that. But sometimes I wonder if you just prefer stories that end with a question. They end, Maigret said. That's enough. Janvier tapped ash into a saucer. You going to see her again? She said she'd return. You think she will? I do. Janvier sipped his coffee when it arrived and said nothing more. They sat that way for a while, two men whose silences meant different things, but whose comfort with one another came from the years of holding those silences without needing to explain them. Eventually Janvier stood. I should get back. There's a robbery on Rue Lepic, all noise and no subtlety. You wouldn't like it. I never did. Janvier smiled and left, his steps already brisk with the movement of younger men chasing louder crimes. Maigret remained, watching the street. There was a quiet rhythm to it now, not the urgent beat of the working day, but the slower pace of early evening. Light lengthened on the walls. Footsteps grew more reflective. Couples passed in quiet pairs. And then, as he reached for his pipe again, he thought, not with certainty, but with something like recognition, that he saw her, a figure in a tan coat, hair pinned up, walking slowly along the opposite pavement. She was not hurrying. She was not looking for anyone. But her eyes, when they passed over the café, did not flinch. Claire Murand. She didn't stop. She didn't wave. But Maigret felt, without needing proof, that she had seen him, that she knew he was there. She turned the corner. He didn't follow. That night at home, the fire burned low in the hearth, and Madame Maigret dozed with her book open on her lap. The knitting basket sat untouched beside her, as though even the yarn had decided it needed rest. Maigret moved quietly, setting his pipe aside, and opened the drawer of the small side table near his armchair. He pulled out a slim folder and leafed through the handwritten pages. Claire's file. Not official. Never to be stamped or reviewed. Just words. Just memory. At the back of the folder was the torn photograph, the fragment recovered from her old apartment, the corner of a man's face and a hand on a shoulder. No context, no caption. He placed it back where it belonged. Then he closed the folder and returned it to the drawer. Madame Maigret stirred. You're not sleeping? Soon. Is it the case again? No, he said. It's not a case. She opened her eyes and looked at him, and in the firelight her gaze was soft but knowing. Sometimes you think about the ones you don't arrest more than the ones you do. He smiled faintly. They stay longer. The fire crackled softly. Did she get better? She asked. Maigret considered the question. She returned. He said, That's better than silence. They sat like that for a while, no radio, no talk, just the hum of the city beyond their windows, the warmth of the room, the weight of two people who understood that not all endings were neat, and not all stories wanted to be solved. Some wanted only to be seen. Some waited years to be noticed, and some, like Claire Murand, wrote their own death notes, not to end, but to begin again, quietly, in their own words.